This morning at St. Peter's Basilica, the faithful lining up to say goodbye. At the center, facing the pews, the coffin carrying Pope Francis.
With Pope Francis's passing, the Vatican suddenly springs into action. There's no room for mistakes. Every detail must be executed flawlessly to avoid chaos. Drawing on centuries of experience and hard-won lessons, the Church follows ironclad protocols, confirming the Pope's death, transferring his body to St. Peter's Basilica, and setting the conclave's date and time with precision. In this moment, every second counts. The very first task is to make absolutely certain the Pope has actually died. In earlier times, this solemn duty took place right in the room where he passed. But today it happens in his private chapel. Here, the Camerlengo, the cardinal who manages the Holy See's property and revenue while the throne is vacant, steps in to lead until a new pope is chosen. He carries out what used to be called the silver hammer ritual. Back in the day, think Leo XIII in 1903, maybe even John XXIII in 1963, someone would gently tap the Pope's head with a small all-silver hammer and call out his baptismal name 3 times. The logic was simple. If you don't stir after a gentle rap, you're almost certainly gone. Thankfully, that hammer hasn't been used on Pope Francis. Instead, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, our current Camerlengo, stood in the chapel and announced 3 times, "George, are you there?" George, of course, being Jorge, his birth name. When there was no answer, he formally declared, "I certify that His Holiness Pope Francis is truly dead." To be doubly sure, he'll often follow that up with something more modern, an electrocardiogram, just as they did for John Paul II in 2005. With the death confirmed, Francis's body is then placed in an open coffin, a recent change. If you remember John Paul II's funeral, his body rested on a raised catafalque, or deathbed. Benedict XVI lay the same way. But in November 2024, Francis opted for a simpler, ground-level casket from the outset, setting yet another fresh precedent for papal farewells. Next, the Camerlengo and his team move quickly to secure the Apostolic Palace and the late Pope's personal effects, guarding against any theft. Centuries ago, looting a Pope's belongings was a real danger. Today, the risk is much lower, but the tradition remains. At the same time, certain items are deliberately destroyed to protect the integrity of the papal office. First to go is the Fisherman's ring, unique to each pope and used to seal official Vatican documents. In medieval times, a wax seal was everything. Without it, no decree carried weight. Cardinal Farrell had Francis's ring broken in front of fellow cardinals to ensure no one could forge papal letters or decrees. In earlier eras, the same silver hammer once used to tap a deceased pope's head delivered the blow. Since Benedict XVI's abdication in 2013, rings have been cut apart in the shape of a cross instead. Witnesses watch as each piece is destroyed, guaranteeing that any future documents bearing that seal are instantly recognized as fakes. The lead seal is likewise destroyed, and the late pope's other belongings are then carefully sorted. Historically significant items are placed in the Vatican archives, gifts and valuables are distributed to those in need, and only in rare circumstances, personal belongings may be returned to the Pope's family. With this inventory complete, the Church moves seamlessly into the next stage of its time-honored succession rites. Once the Camerlengo and his team have secured the late Pope's remains and safeguarded all precious items, the Vatican turns its attention to the period of public mourning. Yet the way each pope has approached this final farewell has varied. Ordinarily, a pope's body is embalmed. Most famously, John XXIII's remains were treated with formalin, a mix of formaldehyde and methanol. When his tomb was reopened in 2001, his preservation was so striking that Cardinal Virgilio Noé remarked he looked as if he'd passed only a day before. Embalming, however, isn't mandatory. John Paul II declined it. And Pope Francis's own wishes will determine whether his body undergoes the same process. Equally indispensable are the Swiss Guards, who accompany the Pope on his last procession from the Apostolic Palace to St. Peter's Basilica. Since Julius II first enlisted their services in 1506, these soldiers have stood vigil, even in death, armed with their iconic pikes and clad in ceremonial armor. Their steadfast loyalty was evident just after Pope Benedict XVI's passing, when they refused to leave his side, even after the lights were extinguished in the Basilica. Their courage harks back to 1527, when 147 guards gave their lives defending Pope Clement VII against 20,000 troops of Emperor Charles V. As for the coffin itself, papal funerals once involved 3 nested caskets: cypress, lead, and oak. But the famously unassuming Francis found that too lavish. Instead, his mortal remains rest in a simple wooden coffin lined with zinc, which will lie in state at St. Peter's for 3 days before he embarks on his final journey. Though so many of his predecessors sleep beneath St. Peter's in the Vatican crypt, Pope Francis chose a different resting place. Beneath the basilica lies an ancient necropolis. Romans long ago buried their dead outside the city limits, and St. Peter's now stands atop one of those burial grounds. But Francis will join the ranks of the faithful at the Basilica of St. Mary Major, the site he announced in December 2023 as his own tomb. Numerous popes still rest beneath St. Peter's, which conceals an ancient necropolis, a true city of the dead. In Roman times, inhumations were confined to these burial grounds outside the city's perimeter, since interments within the walls were strictly prohibited. Ironically, today's basilica stands squarely over one of those very sites. While most popes are laid to rest in the Vatican's crypt, Francis has chosen a different path. In December 2023, he announced he will be interred at the Basilica of St. Mary Major instead. Though this departure from the norm is uncommon, it isn't without precedent. St. Mary Major ranks among Rome's 4 principal papal basilicas and 7 pilgrim churches, a place Francis himself has visited over 100 times during his pontificate. 6 of his predecessors, Honorius III, Nicholas IV, Pius V, Sixtus V, Clement VIII, and Clement IX, already lie there. Yet it's a decidedly archaic choice. The last pope to select that shrine was Clement IX in 1669. In life and in death, Francis will continue to benefit from the Vatican's state-of-the-art security, from the legendary Swiss Guard to advanced surveillance systems that protect every corner of the city-state. With Pope Francis's funeral arrangements in motion, the Vatican's attention swiftly turns to perhaps its most demanding task: selecting his successor. Exactly 1 week after the Pope's passing, the College of Cardinals will gather for 3 days of preparation before entering the conclave. The term conclave, literally with key, was born out of necessity after a 3-year vacancy following Clement IV's death in 1268. Back then, the cardinals convened in the remote town of Viterbo to minimize health risks, only to be famously locked in by frustrated locals. Legend holds that the townspeople, exasperated by the drawn-out election, curtailed the cardinals' rations to bread and water, and even dismantled the roof of the election hall so the electors would hurry their decision and spare themselves the elements. It's a vivid reminder. Sometimes, extreme measures are required to break a stalemate. Ultimately, the cardinals settled on Gregory X in September 1271, but with a twist. He wasn't even among them, nor was he ordained. He was off on a crusade and didn't arrive in Rome until 8 months later. Thankfully, today's process is far more streamlined. Gregory X codified the Viterbo practice by decreeing that if a conclave dragged on past 3 days, the electors would receive just 1 simple meal per day. He also elevated the importance of confidentiality. It wasn't until 1274 that the locked-in conclave became official policy. Prior to that, cardinals were free to discuss proceedings with anyone. Pope Pius X later introduced the secret ballot in the early 1900s. The townspeople of Viterbo could never think of stripping a roof from the Sistine Chapel now. The conclave chamber is hermetically sealed, and the cardinals themselves are cut off. No newspapers, no phones, no internet. During the 2013 election, Vatican engineers even installed Faraday cages and jamming devices to block electronic signals. You can bet they've beefed up these countermeasures with extra jammers to ward off prying drones. These steps might seem over the top, but they've proven effective. So how long should we expect to wait for white smoke this time? The conclave that chose Francis was astonishingly swift, just 24 hours from March 12th to 13th. Likewise, Benedict XVI's election in 2005 took only a single day, from April 18th to 19th. Of course, the process still hinges on a 2/3 majority of the cardinal electors. It helps that the successor is almost always one of their own, though it isn't strictly required. The last time a non-cardinal was chosen was in 1378, when Urban VI was elevated from outside their ranks. Even among close colleagues, early ballots tend to produce more black smoke than white. Francis's election took 5 rounds of voting, with black clouds 4 times before the final white smoke signal. That dark plume is created by burning damp straw mixed with resin, yielding carbon-rich soot. The triumphant white smoke, by contrast, comes from burning clean materials, like wet and dry paper together, to produce water vapor or mineral ash. It's an age-old spectacle, still capturing imaginations every time the chimney puffs in St. Peter's Square. Before that telltale white plume rises, the College of Cardinals approaches the chosen candidate and inquires whether he accepts his election. Once he confirms, they ask what pontifical name he will take. Only then does the white smoke ascend. Behind closed doors, the newly chosen pope will don his customary white robes. Simultaneously, the senior cardinal deacon appears on St. Peter's balcony to proclaim, "Habemus Papam." We have a pope! And moments later, the fresh pope steps out to greet the crowd below. After his inaugural greeting, he returns indoors to address the cardinals, expressing his gratitude for their service and officially closing the conclave. He will then set a date for his formal inauguration. In earlier centuries, that ceremony was a full-blown coronation, rich with elaborate rites. Yet Popes John Paul I, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis all opted for simpler investiture services instead of lavish pageantry. Do you think the next pope will embrace simplicity or revive the pageantry of old? Let us know.